In the summer of 1948, a German prisoner of war stood at the gates of a British camp in Lancashire and was finally told he was free to go home. He had been captured almost exactly 3 years earlier in the last chaotic weeks of the fighting in Europe. 3 years of forced labor, farm work, and, for a stretch of that time, clearing unexploded bombs from the ground of the country that had defeated him. He said no. He wasn't the only one. When the British government finally finished repatriating its German prisoners in the summer of 1948, more than 3 years after Germany had already surrendered, some 32,000 of them chose to stay exactly where they were, in the country that had defeated them, held them, and worked them for years after the fighting had stopped. Before this story goes any further, a quick reminder. While a lot of channels rely on unverified, fake, or exaggerated rumors, we don't play that game. We value your trust. Everything on this channel is strictly verified. Today's episode is sourced from the Wikipedia cross-referenced official record of German prisoners of war in the United Kingdom and Matthew Barry Sullivan's history, Thresholds of Peace, 400,000 German prisoners and the people of Britain, 1944-1948. Full source list is in the description below. Now, let's go back to where this begins. Because the man at that camp gate in 1948 was not an obscure figure history forgot. His name was Bernhard Trautmann. Within a year of walking away from that gate, he would be playing professional football in England's top division, and within a decade, he would be one of the most celebrated goalkeepers in the country he had once been sent to fight. But in the spring of 1945, none of that was even remotely imaginable. In the spring of 1945, he was simply one of hundreds of thousands of German prisoners the British government had captured and had absolutely no clear plan for what to do with. Bernhard Trautmann was 21 years old when the war in Europe finally ended, and by then he had already survived more of it than most men twice his age. He'd grown up in Bremen in a working-class family, joining the Hitler Youth's junior wing as a boy of 10, an almost unremarkable detail for a German child of his generation, since membership in the organization's youth programs had become close to universal by the mid-1930s. He was good at sports. He liked the structure, the physical challenge, the sense of belonging that came with it, in the uncomplicated way a 10-year-old experiences those things without any real grasp of the ideology wrapped around them. He joined the Luftwaffe as a paratrooper early in the war and was sent to the Eastern Front, where he served for roughly 3 years, a stretch of the war responsible for a staggering proportion of German military deaths, and one that Trautmann, by any reasonable accounting, was fortunate to survive at all. Of his original 1,000-man regiment, only around 90 men were still alive by the war's end. He earned 5 medals during that period, including an Iron Cross, decorations that reflected sustained, direct combat experience rather than any desk postings safely behind the lines. By some later accounts, it was on the Eastern Front that something in Trautmann's own view of the war began to shift, witnessing, by his own description in later life, atrocities committed against civilians that sat uneasily against whatever certainty he'd carried into the fighting as a younger man. This detail comes primarily from Trautmann's own later reflections, and we flag it honestly rather than presenting it as independently documented fact. What we can say with confidence is that he survived years of brutal fighting on the war's most lethal front, and that something about the experience left a mark he carried for the rest of his life. The scale of loss on that front for ordinary German soldiers is worth understanding plainly, because it frames just how unusual Trautmann's survival actually was. German casualty rates on the Eastern Front, across the full span of the fighting between 1941 and 1945, were catastrophic by any historical measure, with entire divisions effectively destroyed and rebuilt multiple times over the course of the campaign. A young paratrooper surviving 3 consecutive years in that environment, through some combination of skill, unit assignment, and outright fortune, was already an outlier among his own generation of German servicemen by the time he was eventually moved west. Of his original 1,000-man regiment, as already noted, only around 90 men remained alive by the war's end, a survival rate of under 10%, against which Trautmann's own continued survival stands out as genuinely exceptional, whatever else might be said about the cause he had been fighting for. Late in the war, he was transferred to the Western Front, where the fighting, while still dangerous, was a different kind of war entirely, closer to the collapsing edges of the Reich, closer to the armies that were now closing in from both directions at once. He was one of the few survivors of the Allied bombing of the town of Cleve in 1945, an experience that, by his own account, left him buried briefly in the rubble of a bombed building in France not long after, digging himself out to find he had, again, somehow lived through it. It was in these final chaotic weeks of fighting on the Western Front that his war as a combatant ended. He was captured, first, by some accounts, briefly by American forces, who he later said he feared might simply execute him outright, given the desperate, lawless conditions of the war's final days, where formal surrender procedures did not always hold, and individual soldiers on both sides were making split-second decisions with lethal consequences, before being formally taken into British custody instead. It's worth pausing on what that moment of capture would have actually felt like for a 21-year-old who had already survived 3 years on the war's deadliest front, only to find the ground shifting again in its final days. The German military that had trained him, decorated him, and sent him to 2 different fronts no longer existed in any functional sense by the time British soldiers took him into custody. There was no chain of command left to report to, no unit to rejoin, no clear sense of what came next beyond whatever the men now holding him decided to do with him. For a great many German soldiers captured in these final weeks, that uncertainty was as disorienting as any of the fighting that had preceded it, an entire structure of military life and obedience collapsing within days, replaced by an entirely different, unfamiliar structure controlled by the men who had, until very recently, been trying to kill them. That capture placed him inside a system that, as 1945 unfolded, was rapidly becoming one of the largest and strangest prisoner administrations in British history, one that had never been designed to hold the number of men it was now holding, and had no real plan for how long it might need to. By the time Germany formally surrendered on the 8th of May, 1945, Britain was already holding around 200,000 German prisoners of war on its own soil, a number that had grown steadily through the final year of fighting as Allied forces pushed deeper into occupied Europe and German units surrendered in ever larger numbers. Of those 200,000 men, roughly 70,000 were already working in British agriculture by the time the war in Europe ended, a detail worth sitting with because it tells you something important about how Britain had already come to depend on this labor well before VE Day arrived. This wasn't a policy improvised after the shooting stopped. The War Cabinet had approved the employment of German prisoners of war back in August of 1944, nearly a full year before the war's end, driven by the same basic problem that would define the next 3 years of British POW policy. Britain simply did not have enough working hands left. Millions of British men were still in uniform, still fighting, still stationed overseas. The country's farms, its roads, its bombed-out cities all needed labor that increasingly did not exist among the civilian population. German prisoners of war, however, uncomfortable the arrangement might have looked on paper, filled a gap that had no other obvious solution. Here's where this story stops being about any one man and becomes for a while a story about a system, a genuinely strange, historically unusual set of circumstances that deserves to be laid out plainly on its own terms before we return to how it touched the life of the paratrooper who'd just been taken into custody. VE Day did not end this arrangement. If anything, it made Britain's need for the labor worse. The war against Japan was still ongoing in the Pacific through the summer of 1945, which meant British manpower was still stretched thin, still needed elsewhere, still unavailable to replace the German prisoners of war doing agricultural and reconstruction work across the country. And in a genuinely strange twist of wartime logistics, the number of German POWs held in Britain did not shrink after VE Day, it roughly doubled.
Prisoners who had been captured by British forces but held in camps in the United States, Canada, and Belgium began to be transferred across the Atlantic and across the Channel, rather than released, because their labor too was still considered necessary, and because the infrastructure for actually processing, screening, and repatriating hundreds of thousands of men simply did not exist yet, and would take years to build. Some of these men had been captured years earlier in North Africa or during the fighting in France, and had already spent a considerable portion of the war itself in Allied custody overseas, only to find themselves, upon the war's actual end, transferred yet again to a new country and put back to work rather than finally sent home. This transatlantic movement of prisoners was itself a significant logistical undertaking, requiring ships, escorts, and coordination between British, American, Canadian, and Belgian authorities at a moment when all of these governments were simultaneously managing the enormous separate task of demobilizing their own military forces and beginning the work of post-war reconstruction. That Britain chose deliberately to increase its German prisoner population after the war's end rather than begin winding it down tells you plainly how acute the country's labor shortage genuinely was, and how little appetite the government had for solving that shortage through any faster or more expensive alternative. By September of 1946, 16 months after Germany's surrender, the number of German prisoners of war held in Britain peaked at 402,000 men. 400,000 German prisoners spread across roughly 1,500 camps and hostels scattered the length and breadth of the country, from Scotland to the south coast of England, in a Britain that had already, on paper, won the war more than a year earlier. That number's worth sitting with for a moment, because it's easy to read past a figure like 400,000 without actually picturing what it meant on the ground. It meant German prisoners were, by 1946, a visible everyday presence in ordinary British life in a way that had no real precedent. Farmers in rural Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, and the West Country woke up to German work parties in their fields. Commuters in bombed British cities passed German labor gangs clearing rubble on their way to work. Children in small English towns grew up seeing German prisoners marched and from farm labor as an unremarkable part of daily scenery, a year and then 2 years after a war that for those same children meant nightly blackouts, air raid sirens, and in many cases the loss of fathers or older brothers. The camps themselves varied enormously in size and character. Some were large, purpose-built compounds holding several thousand men with their own internal administration, workshops, and recreational facilities. Others were smaller hostels, often repurposed country houses, military barracks, or even collections of Nissen huts thrown up quickly on requisitioned farmland, holding a few hundred men working a specific local area. The system that had to feed, house, guard, and administer all 400,000 of these men spread across this patchwork of camps was itself a significant undertaking, one that required its own bureaucracy, its own supply chains, and its own steadily growing set of political headaches for the government trying to manage it. There was also a straightforward economic logic behind the arrangement that went beyond simple wartime necessity. German prisoners of war were, in effect, an extremely inexpensive source of labor for a country whose treasury had been drained nearly to the point of exhaustion by 6 years of total war. Paid only a nominal daily allowance rather than a proper civilian wage, working under compulsion rather than free contract, German POWs represented a labor cost British farmers and local authorities could not have replicated with paid civilian workers, even if enough of those workers had actually been available. For cash-strapped local councils trying to repair bomb-damaged infrastructure, and for farmers trying to bring in harvests without the sons and hired hands who were still overseas in uniform, the practical appeal of this arrangement was considerable, whatever discomfort it might have caused when examined too closely against Britain's own stated wartime principles.
What exactly were 400,000 men doing for years in a country that had already defeated them? The honest answer is, nearly everything Britain's own depleted workforce could no longer manage on its own.
Agriculture was the largest single use of German POW labor, and by March of 1947, 170,000 prisoners were working British farms, planting, harvesting, tending livestock, doing the unglamorous, physically exhausting seasonal work that had always depended on large numbers of available hands, and that Britain, drained by 6 years of total war, simply no longer had in sufficient supply among its own civilian population. Farmers who had lost sons, brothers, and hired hands to military service found themselves, often for the first time, working side by side in their own fields with the very soldiers those men had been sent to fight. For many British farming families, this arrangement developed into something considerably more personal than a simple labor contract. Prisoners assigned to a specific farm for months or years at a stretch became, in a great many documented cases, familiar and even trusted presences within the household's daily routine, invited to share meals at the family table, given increasing responsibility over livestock and equipment, sometimes even left largely unsupervised for stretches of the working day once a farmer had come to know and trust the particular men assigned to his land. This was, again, a world away from the tightly guarded, heavily restricted conditions of the war's final year, when any suggestion of this kind of informal trust between British civilians and German prisoners would have seemed unthinkable to almost everyone involved. Beyond the farms, German prisoners were put to work rebuilding what German bombing had destroyed. They repaired roads torn up by years of heavy wartime traffic and neglected maintenance. They worked in brickmaking, in construction, in the unglamorous physical labor of reconstructing a country that had spent 6 years absorbing bomb damage it had never had the spare capacity to properly repair while the fighting was still ongoing. In London, German POWs were among those who swept up the rubbish left behind after the enormous VE Day celebrations themselves, a detail almost too pointed to need commentary. Prisoners cleaning up the wreckage of a party thrown to celebrate the war they had just lost. Later, some of the same labor force helped construct Wembley Way ahead of the 1948 London Olympics, infrastructure for a global celebration of peace and international unity, built in part by men who, 3 years earlier, had still been enemy combatants. And then was the most dangerous work of all: bomb disposal. Britain, after years of German bombing raids, was littered with unexploded ordnance, bombs that had fallen and failed to detonate, buried in fields, in rubble, in the foundations of bombed-out buildings, each one a live, unpredictable hazard that had to be located and safely disposed of before normal life could fully resume. This work was expressly forbidden for prisoners of war under the terms of the Geneva Convention, which prohibited using POW labor for dangerous work connected to war operations. Britain's official position was that the convention no longer strictly applied in this specific way in the post-war period, and separately that the prisoners assigned to this work had technically volunteered for it. It's worth pausing on how thin that justification looks with any real scrutiny and being honest about it rather than smoothing it over. A prisoner's volunteering for hazardous duty inside a captivity system he had no real power to leave, no ability to appeal, and very limited legal standing to refuse, is not straightforwardly the same thing as a free civilian choosing dangerous work of his own accord. Whatever the technical legal argument Britain relied on, the practical reality was that German prisoners of war were, for a period of years after the fighting had officially ended, defusing live explosive ordnance on British soil.
The daily rhythm of camp life for most prisoners followed a similar basic pattern regardless of which specific job a man had been assigned. Reveille in the early morning, a modest breakfast, transport or a march out to the day's work site, hours of physical labour under the supervision of a British Guard detail, a return to camp in the evening, and whatever limited recreation the men could organise for themselves in the hours before lights out. Pay, where it existed at all, was minimal. Prisoners typically received a small daily allowance, often described at less than a shilling a day, enough to purchase a handful of cigarettes at the camp canteen and little else. It was not by any measure a comfortable existence, but compared to the conditions many of these same men had endured in the final desperate months of the war itself, several former prisoners later reflected that hard agricultural labour, however grinding, was a considerable improvement over what they had left behind on the battlefield. For prisoners assigned to bomb disposal specifically, the calculation was different and the stakes considerably higher. Unexploded ordnance did not become safer with time. If anything, the opposite was often true, as corrosion and instability increased the longer a bomb sat undisturbed in the ground. Prisoners assigned to this work were, in effect, being asked to apply their own wartime training and experience with explosives against devices that could, and occasionally did, kill the men attempting to defuse them. The precise number of German POWs killed or injured during bomb disposal work in post-war Britain is not comprehensively documented in the available historical record, and this account does not claim a figure it cannot verify. What can be said with confidence is that the work carried real, ongoing lethal risk, performed by men with limited legal standing to refuse it, years after the war that had created the danger in the first place had already ended. Alongside the labour itself, Britain also ran a formal programme of political re-education inside many of the larger camps, an effort that had been under discussion within the British government since not long after the war against Germany had even begun. The goal, at least on paper, was to expose German prisoners to democratic values and institutions, and to actively counter the ideological instruction many of them had received under the previous regime, before they were eventually released back into a Germany the Allies hoped to see rebuilt along fundamentally different political lines. This effort was not without friction. In some camps, particularly in the earlier years, pro-regime sentiment among certain prisoners remained strong enough that men who spoke openly against the government they had served were, in a number of documented cases, beaten or otherwise intimidated by fellow prisoners for doing so, and pressured against volunteering for outside work details that might expose them to British civilian life and ideas. British camp authorities had to actively manage these internal tensions among their own prisoner population on top of everything else the system already demanded of them. This is exactly the kind of work that would, before very long, become part of Bernhard Trautmann's own story.
By now, Trautmann had been moved through several different camps, following a process that every German prisoner captured by British forces was subjected to at some point in his captivity: political screening. Britain's system for classifying its German prisoners was, in principle, straightforward. Every prisoner was interviewed and sorted into a category, ranging from A+ down through C-, informally shorthanded, in the language of the time, as white, gray, or black. A prisoner classified as Category A, or white, was judged to hold no meaningful attachment to Nazi ideology and was considered broadly trustworthy, suitable for the greatest degree of freedom and responsibility the system allowed. Category B, or gray, covered the broad, uncertain middle, men judged politically apathetic, opportunistic, or simply unreadable through a single interview, the largest single group by far among the hundreds of thousands screened. Category C, or black, was reserved for prisoners judged to be committed, convinced adherents of the regime, men considered a continuing security or ideological risk, regardless of the fact that the war itself was already over. This screening exercise was, by any measure, an enormous undertaking. Interviewing and categorizing roughly 400,000 individual men required a substantial dedicated staff of interviewers working through translators over a period of years, generating an enormous paper record that historians have only in recent years begun to analyze in full statistical detail. The process was never intended to be a formal legal proceeding with the evidentiary standards of a courtroom. It was in practice closer to a rapid administrative triage, an attempt to sort an unmanageably large population of former enemy soldiers into rough categories of risk and trustworthiness, using the limited tools and time available in order to make decisions about labor assignments, camp placement, and eventually the order in which men would be considered for repatriation. As a volunteer soldier who had served as a paratrooper, an elite, ideologically favored branch of the German military, Trautmann was initially classified Category C. In the language of the British screening system, he was regarded, at least on paper, as what the record describes plainly as a pure Nazi. It's worth being honest about what this classification actually meant and didn't mean, because the historical record on Britain's screening process is more complicated than the simple category label suggests. Recent detailed analysis of the roughly 400,000 screening interviews conducted during this period has found that the process was inconsistent, resource-constrained, and lacked any single coherent definition of what actually counted as genuine Nazi conviction versus simple wartime service in a Nazi state's armed forces. The bar for classifying someone as a committed Nazi was, in practice, higher than the wartime rhetoric conflating German and Nazi might suggest, and the bar for classifying someone as genuinely anti-Nazi was equally high, since most prisoners screened were found to fall into neither extreme, judged instead as broadly apolitical, opportunistic, or simply disillusioned by 1945 with a regime that had led their country into total ruin. Whatever the precise reasoning behind Trautmann's initial Category C classification, it did not remain fixed. He was, at some point during his captivity, downgraded from Category C to Category B, reassessed as no longer regarded, in the system's own language, as a committed Nazi. The specific interview or circumstances behind that reclassification are not detailed in the available record, and honest history says so rather than inventing a dramatic scene that was never documented. It's worth pausing here on what a Category C classification would have meant for a man's day-to-day existence before any reclassification changed it. Category C prisoners were typically held under considerably tighter restriction than their Category A or B counterparts: less freedom of movement, closer supervision during work assignments, fewer opportunities for the kind of informal contact with British civilians that had, by the later years of the system, become increasingly common for prisoners in the higher trust categories. For a young paratrooper who had already survived years of brutal combat, arriving in Britain only to be formally labeled, on official government paperwork, as one of the most ideologically dangerous kinds of prisoner in the entire system would have been its own particular kind of disorienting experience, a judgment rendered by strangers in a foreign language, based on a branch of service and a set of medals, rather than anything he had actually said or done as an individual. What we do know is that this reclassification mattered practically as well as symbolically. It affected what kind of camp he could be held in, what kind of work he might be trusted with, and how much freedom of movement and interaction with the British public he might eventually be permitted. Prisoners classified in the higher, more trusted categories over time were given progressively greater latitude, permitted to work with less direct supervision, to interact more freely with the British civilians whose farms and towns they were laboring in, and eventually, as the years wore on, to participate in the kind of ordinary community life that would have been unthinkable for a black Category C prisoner in the tense, wary months immediately following the war's end. The screening process itself, conducted by a limited number of trained interviewers working through an enormous backlog of hundreds of thousands of individual cases, was necessarily imperfect. Interviewers had to make judgments about a man's political convictions based on a single interview, often through an interpreter, with limited independent means of verifying what a prisoner told them about his own wartime beliefs and conduct. Some genuinely committed ideologues likely talked their way into more favorable categories than they deserved. Some prisoners who had, in reality, harbored serious doubts about the regime they'd served were likely misjudged as more committed than they actually were, based on superficial factors like their branch of service or the medals they had been awarded. The system was a blunt instrument applied to a genuinely difficult problem, sorting hundreds of thousands of individual human beings by the sincerity and depth of political convictions that even the men themselves might not have fully examined before the war ended and forced the question on them. It was somewhere around this point in his captivity that Trautmann was transferred to a camp in Ashton and Makerfield in Lancashire, the camp where the next entirely unexpected chapter of his story would begin.
While men like Trautmann were being screened, reclassified, and put to work across hundreds of camps, a very different conversation was unfolding in London, one that had almost nothing to do with any individual prisoner and everything to do with what kind of country Britain wanted to be seen as, barely a year removed from a war fought in significant part in the name of human freedom and dignity. Because this is where the story has to step back from any single person's experience and simply lay out what was actually happening in British public life, plainly on its own terms. By 1946, with hundreds of thousands of German prisoners still working the length and breadth of the country more than a year after VE Day, a genuine and increasingly uncomfortable political controversy had taken shape. In March of that year, the Labour Member of Parliament, Richard Stokes, stood up and argued that the German prisoners were entitled, at minimum, to know when they might actually be released, that holding men indefinitely without any announced timetable was an affront to their basic human rights, and, in his words, a betrayal of the very British values the country claimed to be defending. It was a striking argument to make in Parliament so soon after a war against an enemy state, insisting that former enemy soldiers retained rights Britain, as what Stokes called a foremost guardian of such rights, was now obligated to respect. Stokes was not a lone voice. A public campaign called Save Europe Now, founded in September of 1945 by the left-wing publisher Victor Gollancz, pushed hard on the same set of concerns, pressing for faster repatriation and describing the continued use of German prisoner labor bluntly as a form of slave labor. Gollancz's campaign drew support from figures who would go on to considerable political prominence, including the future Labour Party leader Michael Foot, and it kept the moral discomfort of the situation squarely in the public eye through newspaper columns, pamphlets, and direct political pressure, publishing repeated appeals over the following several years urging both faster repatriation and better conditions for German civilians in the British occupation zone of Germany itself, a related but distinct concern that Gollancz saw as fundamentally connected to how Britain was treating German prisoners on its own soil. Gollancz's core argument, articulated across numerous pamphlets and public addresses over the campaign's several years of activity, was that a nation which had fought a war explicitly framed around the defense of human dignity and democratic values could not credibly continue that argument while holding hundreds of thousands of men in indefinite, unpaid, or barely paid captivity long after any genuine military necessity for doing so had passed. It was, in his view, a corrosive hypocrisy that risked undermining Britain's own moral standing in the post-war world it was now trying to help rebuild. The core of the discomfort, as multiple contemporary accounts described it, was a specific and pointed one. Britain was at the same moment actively promoting the values of democracy and human dignity across occupied Germany, while keeping hundreds of thousands of German men interned indefinitely on British soil with no clear release date, doing labor many of them had little genuine choice about performing. The contradiction was not lost on the press, on Parliament, and, pointedly, on the prisoners themselves, some of whom found ways to make their own frustration with the arrangement known.
The government's practical counterargument was straightforward, if uncomfortable. Britain genuinely needed the labor. The country's own workforce genuinely could not fill the gap on its own, particularly in agriculture, and an abrupt mass release of 400,000 men into a shattered post-war Germany, itself barely capable of feeding its own population, carried its own serious risks and complications. Neither side of this argument was entirely wrong, which is precisely what made it such a genuinely difficult and drawn-out political controversy, rather than a simple case of obvious injustice with an easy fix. The debate played out over more than 2 years in Parliament, in newspaper editorials, in the pamphlets and public meetings organized by Gallance's campaign, and in the quieter day-to-day frustrations of prisoners themselves, some of whom staged small protests or work slowdowns in specific camps to express their displeasure at the lack of a clear timeline. British public opinion on the matter was itself divided. Some segments of the public, particularly farming communities who had come to rely on and, in many cases, genuinely appreciate their German laborers, felt no particular urgency to see them go. Others, especially in communities that had suffered direct bombing damage during the war, felt considerably less patience for the continued presence of German men on British soil, prisoner status or not. General repatriation of German prisoners from Britain finally began in September of 1946, the same month the prisoner population had reached its peak of 402,000 men. It would take nearly 2 more years, until July of 1948, for that process to be fully completed, meaning the very last German prisoners of war held in Britain did not leave the country one way or another until more than 3 full years after the fighting in Europe had ended.
If the political story in London was one of mounting discomfort and slow-moving policy, the story unfolding in the actual camps and farms and villages across Britain was, in many respects, a good deal warmer and more complicated than the slave labor framing of the Save Europe Now campaign suggested on its own. Because this, too, is worth telling plainly, on its own terms, rather than folding it entirely into any one man's personal journey. Britain's treatment of its German prisoners was, by the standards of the era and by comparison to how prisoners of war were treated by several other combatant nations, genuinely humane in most respects. Historians studying the period have noted that the death rate among German prisoners in British captivity was markedly lower than that recorded in some other Allied nations' custody. This wasn't an accident. It reflected, however imperfectly applied, a real institutional commitment to treating captured enemy soldiers according to established international norms, even as those same institutions kept the same men working indefinitely without a clear release date. Local relationships between German prisoners and British communities they worked in and among grew over the course of these years in ways that surprised a great many people on both sides. Early on, formal rules strictly limited fraternization between British civilians and German prisoners, understandable in a country whose population had spent years enduring German bombing, whose families had lost sons and husbands and fathers to the same military the prisoners had served in. But as the months and then years wore on, those rules began gradually and unevenly to relax. By the approach of Christmas in 1946, calls grew for a temporary loosening of the fraternization restrictions, and the government relented, allowing the public to invite well-behaved prisoners into their own homes for the holiday. At a camp in Saffron Walden, a local clergyman, the Reverend Roy Sinker, took to describing the prisoners under his community's watch as ambassadors in chains, publicly encouraging local families to welcome them for Christmas dinner rather than continue treating them purely as enemy combatants long after the actual fighting had stopped. Fraternization rules relaxed further still over the following year, to the point that by June of 1947, marriages between German prisoners and British women were formally permitted, official recognition of relationships that had, in a great many cases, already quietly formed in fields, farmhouses, and village halls across the country.
Historians who have studied British public attitudes toward German prisoners across this period have generally found hostility where it existed was concentrated most heavily in the earliest months after the war's end, and eased steadily and unevenly as the months turned into years. Farming communities in particular developed working relationships with their assigned German laborers that in many documented cases shaded into genuine mutual respect and occasionally warmth, men working side by side through entire agricultural seasons, sharing meals, learning fragments of each other's language, building the kind of ordinary daily familiarity that formal wartime propaganda on both sides had spent years trying to prevent. This was not universal. Some communities and some individual British families who had lost loved ones directly to German military action understandably wanted nothing to do with the prisoners working nearby and made their feelings known. But the broader trend, documented across multiple contemporary and later historical accounts, was one of gradual, halting, but genuine normalization. By the time repatriation was finally completed in the summer of 1948, roughly 32,000 of the German men who had passed through Britain's prisoner of war system chose to remain in the country as civilian workers rather than return home. Some had married British women. Some had simply built lives, friendships, and working relationships that felt by that point more like home than the shattered, divided, uncertain Germany many of them would have been returning to. Some from regions of eastern Germany whose borders had been redrawn entirely in the war's aftermath quite literally no longer had a home to return to in any meaningful sense, their towns and villages now sitting inside Polish or Soviet-administered territory, populated by different people entirely. The stories of these 32,000 men taken together resist any single simple explanation. Some, like the prisoner named Rostel, originally from a town in what had been eastern Germany and was now, following the post-war redrawing of borders, part of Poland, settled permanently in southern Scotland, having quite literally lost any German town to return to. Decades later, some of these men would be reunited in old age with siblings and family members they had lost contact with entirely during the chaos of the war's final years and the displacement that followed it. Reunions that, when they happened at all, sometimes came 70 or 80 years after the two sides had last seen each other. Historians studying this period have suggested that the eventual, gradual integration of these German former prisoners into British communities did real, lasting work in healing some of the deeper wounds the war had left behind, helping lay early groundwork for the closer ties between Britain and continental Europe that would develop over the following decades. A quiet, largely unrecognized legacy belonging to ordinary men whose individual stories rarely made the history books. Among that group of 32,000 men who stayed was the paratrooper who had once been classified on official British paperwork as a POW Nazi.
Life at the camp in Ashton in Makerfield, by the time Trautmann arrived there, had settled into something considerably less grim than the earliest, most tightly restricted years of British captivity. Prisoners organized their own recreation to pass the long stretches of time between work assignments, and football, unsurprisingly for a generation of young German men, was a natural choice. Matches were arranged regularly inside the camp and eventually against local amateur sides from the surrounding Lancashire towns, a detail that tells you something about how far fraternization restrictions had genuinely eased by this stage, that German prisoners and English amateur footballers were, within a few years of the war's end, regularly playing organized matches against one another. Trautmann, in these matches, usually played outfield rather than in goal. It was, according to the record, almost entirely a matter of chance that changed that. In one organized match against a local side, playing at centre-half, he picked up an injury during the game. Rather than come off, he asked to swap positions with the camp's regular goalkeeper and finish the match between the posts instead. It's worth being clear that this detail, while widely repeated across biographical accounts of Trautmann's life, is the kind of small, human, almost accidental turning point that's easy to romanticize in hindsight.
We don't have a dramatic blow-by-blow account of that specific afternoon beyond what's been passed down in later retrospectives and club histories. What the record does support clearly is that from that point forward Trautmann played in goal, a position switch that would, within a few short years, change the entire course of his life, though nobody standing on that muddy Lancashire pitch in the mid-1940s could possibly have known it at the time. It was also during his time in the camp that he picked up the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life. English guards, struggling with the pronunciation of Bernhard, began calling him simply Bert, a small, almost throwaway act of casual familiarity between captor and captive that, like so much else in this story, sits somewhere in the space between the coldly institutional and the genuinely human. It's worth pausing on just how unusual this kind of casual, almost affectionate relationship between guard and prisoner would have seemed only a year or two earlier, in the immediate aftermath of the war, when tensions and suspicions on both sides ran considerably higher. By the time Trautmann was playing regular matches against local Lancashire sides, something in the day-to-day texture of British-German relations at the ground level had visibly softened, even as the political controversy over repatriation continued to rage in Parliament and the press hundreds of miles away in London. The men guarding the camp were not diplomats or policy-makers. They were, for the most part, ordinary British soldiers doing a fairly unglamorous job, and many of them appear to have arrived, over months and years of close proximity, to a far more individualized human view of the specific German prisoners in their charge than the broad political rhetoric of the era might have suggested was possible. Football, in particular, seems to have functioned as a genuine bridge in ways that direct political or moral argument rarely managed to do, a shared familiar language that did not require either side to resolve the larger, thornier questions of guilt, forgiveness, or national reckoning still hanging over the relationship between their two countries. Trautmann himself was, by several later accounts, a serious and driven presence between the posts, even in these informal camp and amateur matches, bringing the same physical toughness that had helped him survive years on the Eastern Front to a game that for him had started as little more than a way to fill the long, monotonous hours of captivity. Football was far from the only recreation prisoners organized for themselves across the camp system, though it was, by most accounts, among the most popular. Camps with sufficient numbers and resources ran their own theatre groups, orchestras, and educational classes, some taught by prisoners who had been engineers, teachers, or tradesmen in civilian life before the war swept them into uniform. A handful of camps even ran informal universities of a sort, offering prisoners the chance to continue or begin academic study during the long, otherwise unproductive hours between work assignments. This kind of organized recreation served a practical purpose beyond simply keeping morale from collapsing entirely. Camp authorities on the British side generally understood that idle, demoralized prisoners were harder to manage and more prone to unrest than men with some structured, purposeful way to occupy their time. For Trautmann and the men around him at Ashton-in-Makerfield, football filled precisely that role, and would end up mattering to his own life far more than anyone standing on that muddy Lancashire pitch in the mid-1940s could possibly have known it at the time. By now, the broader machinery of British repatriation policy, the political pressure from Stokes and Gollantz's campaign, the practical labour calculations of a government still short on workers, the slow, uneven relaxation of restrictions that had let Trautmann play football against local Lancashire sides in the first place, had converged on a single concrete moment for the man himself. The camp at Ashton-in-Makerfield finally closed in 1948, 3 full years after Germany's formal surrender. Trautmann, like every other prisoner still held there, was finally offered the thing men in his position had been waiting years to hear: repatriation, a ticket home, An end, after 3 years of forced labor that had included farm work and stints on bomb disposal crews clearing unexploded ordnance from British soil, to his captivity entirely. He turned it down. This is worth sitting with directly, because it's the moment this whole story has been building toward, and it deserves to be treated with the weight it carries, rather than rushed past. By his own later account, Trautmann had, over the course of 3 years, come to feel genuinely at home in the English town where he'd been held, an extraordinary thing to say about a place you'd originally arrived at as a captured enemy combatant, and a testament to just how far the relationships and rhythms of daily life had shifted since the tightly restricted early days of British captivity. He had gotten to know local people. He had played football regularly for a local amateur side. He had, by several accounts, already met Margaret Fryer, the daughter of the secretary of St. Helens Town Football Club, the woman he would go on to marry. Rather than return to a Germany he had not seen in years, a country still divided, still rebuilding, still reckoning with the full scale of what the regime he'd once served in had done, Trautmann chose to stay in Lancashire, combining farm work with playing goalkeeper for St. Helens Town on an amateur basis. It's worth trying to imagine the actual weight of that decision standing at the gate in 1948. Trautmann had not seen his family, his hometown of Bremen, or anything resembling ordinary German civilian life in years. He had no way of knowing in any detail what condition his family was in, what had become of the city he'd grown up in, or what kind of welcome, if any, awaited a returning former paratrooper in a defeated, divided, still struggling Germany. Bremen itself had suffered extensive bombing damage during the war, like most major German industrial cities, and reconstruction was still in its earliest stages by 1948. Choosing to stay in Lancashire was not simply a choice for the familiar over the unfamiliar. In important respects, by 1948, Britain, with its farms, its football pitches, the people he had come to know by name, had become the more familiar of his 2 available lives, and the Germany he might have returned to had become, after years of separation and silence, the genuinely uncertain unknown. He was not alone in that choice. 32,000 other men made broadly similar decisions that same year, for their own broadly similar reasons. A relationship, a lost homeland, a life quietly built during years of captivity that had, against every reasonable expectation, come to feel more like a beginning than an ending.
None of what followed was inevitable or easy, and it's worth being honest about that too, rather than letting the story slide into a tidy, feel-good ending it didn't fully earn without real friction along the way. Trautmann's performances for St. Helens Town drew attention from bigger clubs, and in October of 1949, Manchester City signed him, initially as an amateur, turning professional shortly after, to compete for the position of first-choice goalkeeper in England's top division. The decision was, by any measure, controversial. Manchester City had a significant Jewish community among its supporters, and the club's choice to sign a former Luftwaffe paratrooper, a man who had once been classified by British authorities themselves as a committed Nazi, provoked real and immediate backlash. Roughly 20,000 people took part in protests against the signing. Trautmann received hate mail. Before his first home match, a local religious leader felt compelled to publish an open letter in the local newspaper, appealing directly to Manchester City's supporters to treat him with basic respect regardless of his wartime service. It's worth being precise here, because the full picture matters. The city's own communal rabbi ultimately spoke out in Trautmann's favor, a detail that complicates any simple narrative of uniform hostility, and one that speaks to a broader, more complicated set of individual judgments being made across Manchester at the time, rather than a single unanimous verdict either for or against him. Whatever the initial reception, it did not last in that form. Trautmann's performances on the pitch were, by all accounts, genuinely exceptional,
Commanding, fearless, willing to come off his line and confront danger directly rather than simply guard it from a distance, a quality that would define his reputation for the rest of his career. His debut for Manchester City came away to Bolton Wanderers on the 19th of November 1949, a match he entered under a level of public scrutiny and outright hostility that few professional debuts in English football history have ever matched, playing a sport in front of crowds that in some cases had gathered specifically to protest his presence on the pitch before a ball had even been kicked. The chants and jeers that had greeted his debut gradually gave way to cheers, and within a few short years, Bert Trautmann had become one of the most respected goalkeepers in English football, eventually earning the Football Writers Association Footballer of the Year award, the first goalkeeper in the award's history to receive it. He went on to make close to 500 appearances for Manchester City across a career spanning more than a decade, becoming by the time he finally retired from professional football one of the club's most enduringly beloved figures, and eventually receiving an OBE in recognition of his contribution to Anglo-German relations, an extraordinary honor for a man who had arrived in the country only years earlier as a captured enemy paratrooper. His career reached its most famous moment in the 1956 FA Cup final, when he played the closing minutes of the match with what was later discovered to be a broken neck, refusing to leave the pitch, helping Manchester City to a winning result in a moment of raw physical courage that would cement his legend in English football for decades to come, regardless of where he'd been born or which uniform he'd once worn. The path to that famous final had itself run through an earlier, less triumphant one. Manchester City had reached the FA Cup final the year before, in 1955, losing to Newcastle United, before returning the following year to face Birmingham with a more settled, more experienced side, built substantially around Trautmann's now well-established reputation as one of the finest goalkeepers in the country. Shortly before that 1956 final, he became the first goalkeeper in the history of English football to win the Football Writers Association Footballer of the Year award, a formal public acknowledgement voted on by the country's own football journalists that the man Manchester City fans had once protested against in the streets was now recognized as among the very best at his position in the entire country. Manchester City took an early lead in the final, just 3 minutes in, before Birmingham equalized. The match remained level until midway through the second half, when City scored twice in quick succession to take control. It was deep into that second half, diving at the feet of an onrushing Birmingham forward to smother a dangerous chance, that Trautmann suffered the injury that would define the match and in many ways define the rest of his public legacy. He played on, visibly in pain, for the remaining minutes of the game, helping see out Manchester City's win before the true severity of the injury was understood. Only in the days that followed did doctors confirm what had actually happened on the pitch. He had broken his neck and continued playing an FA Cup final in that condition rather than leave the field.
By the time the last German prisoners of war finally left British soil in the summer of 1948, more than 3 years after VE Day, the sheer scale of what had happened was already beginning to fade from public memory, the way large, uncomfortable, administratively complicated chapters of history so often do once the paperwork is finally closed and the last man has finally gone home, or, in some cases, chosen not to. 400,000 men at the system's peak, still held on the soil of a country that had already won the war. Hundreds of thousands of them working farms, rebuilding roads, clearing rubble, in some cases defusing live explosive ordnance under a legal justification that strained the plain language of the Geneva Convention past what most honest readings of it could comfortably support. A political controversy that pitted basic questions of human rights and consistency against equally real, equally pressing questions of labor shortage and post-war recovery, with neither side of that argument ever fully or cleanly winning out over the other. And scattered among those 400,000 men, individual stories that resist easy categorization entirely, men who arrived as enemy combatants and left years later as neighbors, husbands, colleagues, and in at least one remarkable case, a genuine national sporting hero. It's worth returning, honestly, to the specific tension at the heart of Trautmann's own story, because it's the tension at the heart of this entire episode. A man once formally classified by British authorities as a pure Nazi went on to become one of the most beloved figures in English football, in a country that had, only a handful of years earlier, been locked in total war against the very military he had served in. That's not a comfortable, simple story. It's not meant to be. The honest history here resists flattening Trautmann into either a straightforward villain of his early Hitler Youth years or a straightforward redemption story of his later football fame. Both things were true of the same man at different points in a single complicated life, and the years he spent as a prisoner of war in Britain, years the British government itself struggled, publicly and repeatedly to justify, with a strange, unplanned bridge between the two. The wider system that produced his story deserves the same honest, unresolved treatment. Britain's decision to keep hundreds of thousands of German prisoners working for years after the war's official end was never a single clean policy with a single clear justification. It was a tangle of genuine post-war necessity, institutional inertia, unresolved legal ambiguity around the Geneva Convention, and, underneath all of it, hundreds of thousands of individual human relationships forming in fields and farmhouses and camp football pitches, largely outside the notice or control of the politicians in London arguing about the policy in the abstract. The men who lived through it, both the German prisoners and the British families and communities who worked alongside them, experienced something considerably more textured and more human than the parliamentary debates or the newspaper headlines of the era ever fully captured. Some of those men wrote home aching to leave the moment the opportunity arose. Others, like Trautmann, found that the years of captivity had, almost accidentally, built them a different life than the one interrupted by the war, one they were, in the end, unwilling to give up. None of this made sense yet to the 400,000 men still waiting in camps across Britain in the tense, uncertain months right after VE Day, when nobody could have told them how long their captivity would actually last, or how differently each of their individual stories would eventually turn out. Some would be home within a year. Others would spend 3 more years working British fields and clearing British rubble before finally learning their fate. And a small fraction, for reasons as varied and human as the men themselves, would decide that fate was better served by staying exactly where they already were. In the summer of 1948, at the gates of a Lancashire prison camp, a former paratrooper was finally offered the thing he'd waited 3 years for, a ticket home. He said no, not because the offer wasn't real, and not because his captivity had been anything other than what it plainly was, years of forced labor, including work Britain itself technically wasn't supposed to be assigning him, in a system the country's own parliament argued about, uncomfortably, for years. He said no because somewhere in those 3 years, in a system nobody had fully planned for and nobody was entirely proud of, he'd built something that felt, against every reasonable expectation, like a life worth staying for. 331,000 German men went home in the years after VE Day, most of them glad, finally, to leave. 32,000 others looked at the same offer and chose to stay. Both of those numbers are part of the same true story, one that Britain for a long time preferred not to look at too closely. If you believe stories like this one, the uncomfortable, complicated ones, not just the clean and heroic ones, subscribe. That's the whole reason this channel exists.